Thank you so much. And I want to apologize for the confusion because somehow in the final problem, two speakers were lost. Sorry about that, but I think it's a good surprise. I will introduce everybody shortly. So for this panel, we invited people from different sides of the open source world so we can discuss different angles of the problem. I give you Nithya Roof from Amazon. She's head of open source program in Amazon and has been in different companies before. Then I have Roman Shaposhnik. He is VP of Legal at Apache Software Foundation and also entrepreneur doing his third open source startup and has been in the open source community for over 20 years. And then we have Dmitry Belyaev, who represents academia today. He's from Oxford University, a professor and a mathematician. And I am Tanya Dadasheva. I also am an open source entrepreneur, but before that I was in a venture capital firm for 8 years, investing in open source. So I will be representing the business part in this discussion. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And the question, as you have seen, is to discuss what open is in open source AI. Is it even open source? What is open in AI? What do we need to have open? But before going into that, I want to a little bit discuss like why we love open source and what have always been there and what is missing now. Why is it a different even question for open source AI? So this is my first question to the panelists. Like, how does it feel different these days? And what is the most missed part that you're used to and have always been having in your careers, but now you have a feeling that it's not there? So let's start, Nithya.
So why is it different and why is open different now?
Yeah, what do you miss the most in the discussions about AI? What you have been used to in the open source world?
I think open source was just software for the most part, and then of course there's been open hardware. So we were very used to how software is licensed, copyrights, and the whole constructs and frameworks for dealing with software. But as Julia explained this morning in the keynote, but also in her talk, AI is a whole different ball game, AI and machine learning, and has so many different components to it, some of which is software, some of which is data, some of which is mathematical algorithms, some of it is weights. And so it becomes harder to kind of take one old framework like copyright and say, how do you apply it to all this? And so we have to think differently about how we talk open in AI. The second piece I would say is that we have to also be cognizant of fairness, bias, ethical use, etc. in AI, unlike any time in software. I mean, it's much more important now.
Yeah, I guess I will maybe come at it from a community angle. So I joined the open source movement a long time ago. And from the day one, when I was still in school, it felt like a very communal exercise, right? I was basically a guy just, studying back in Russia, right? Didn't know much. And yet I could contribute to one of the biggest projects. Well, at the time it didn't feel that big, Linux kernel. But, my patches got accepted, right? It was very communal. People would, explain to you the ropes, what need to be done, whatever. Nowadays, if you're trying to actually contribute to AI, not just use it, not just, use ChatGPT for something, right? How do you do it even? Like, if you're just a kid in school and you want to fine-tune a model that's available someplace, what do you do? Like, if it's easy if you're in academia and you have, your professor telling you what to do, but like, if you're just a kid, like, what do you do? How can you join this, massive movement and feel like you're contributing, feel like you're being productive? That's what's missing to me the biggest.
No, but actually, I would be teasing Roman because he can wear different hats, like the hat of the community, but also I want to hear it from the hat of foundations. Like, what changed, and do you feel like you are losing control, or that you don't know how to attract people anymore, and that do you feel relevant, irrelevant right now?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So foundations, again, you all know open source foundations, right? Linux Foundation, Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse. they were kind of basically built as homes for those communities, right? So the community always came first. And then, some people who already were a community came together and says, like, let's give ourselves a name. Let's call ourselves, Apache Software Foundation. But the community was there. So what I think is interesting right now is that none of those communities feel that they're basically kind of part of that AI movement. We're sort of somewhat part, let's say ASF produces a lot of software that's used for the infrastructure of AI, but we're not really in any way connected to the next, breakthroughs and foundational models, right? So to us, the biggest question is, like, what do we all need to figure out and maybe align our values, maybe somehow tweak our values, or maybe figure out what are the values of this new emergent, community of young AI developers, right? Where will they put up a tent and call it a home? Will it be something completely new, or will it be one of the existing foundations? I think all of us should really think about this, very, very hard, because otherwise we'll just at some point become irrelevant to this huge mass of, effectively developers.
So first of all, I'm not really agree with you about that it's easy in academia because we don't have access to a lot of it. And if you're a professor and you want to play around with AI, then you can't really do this unless you are one of very few people with massive grants, but even then you don't have access to infrastructure. So actually a big difference is that we always were relying very heavily on open software, and a lot of things that we produce is in public domain, and right now it's a firm requirement of all funders that everything should be in open access, even things that traditionally were not, like publications, they cannot be behind paywall anymore. But we don't have, so there are, I think, two things. One is that I think partially it's language barrier between our community and other communities. So we speak different language and there is not enough communication between these communities. But we also don't have really access. So some of it is done through various schemes where we share information. So I have colleagues who work in, say, mathematical finance. Quite often they collaborate with banks, so banks give them data so that they can play with it. But then there are a lot of strings attached, what they can do with this data, what they can publish. So quite often they do something, but most of it goes to banks and they can publish very small part of it.
Yeah, and I think this leads us to the second part of it, what is actually open. Like with this software, it was clear that it's like the software, you can download it, you can use it, you can change it. But actually right now with models, is like, what do you need to replicate the model? What do you need to run the model? What do you need to train the model? All of these are very good questions. And I want to like split it in different parts because like first part is data. Like who has the data, who doesn't, and that's to Dmitri's point, like university don't really have the data. Like maybe some people give it to them under NDAs, maybe they can just get it from the public domain, but they don't really have it. So enterprises do have data, but enterprises don't really want to share it. But again, what is getting shared then? Is it the result of the work? Is it the model? Is it a publication? Is it some other result that's getting shared? So for me, it's really confusing, but I really want to hear the perspective of different, again, sides of the world. Like, have you run already in problems with this in your work? Or is it more like theoretical discussions right now that these barriers kind of are mental barriers? So what's your view?
I think there are two pieces, right? If you're an enterprise and you want to use the model for your internal predictions and insights, then you want to keep your data kind of to yourself, and you want to train the model on your data. So I think there's that use case. But then for other models, more general models, the generative AI type of models, it is an issue. They have a lot of the early models kind of scraped the net and used everything that was there. And now I think they're running into issues of quality of data, but they're also running into legal issues. Can I or can I not use this data? The whole world of open data needs to be more standardized in terms of what you can and cannot use and how do you make it open. And I think Julia's talk also talked about the fact that what is truly open is if all of the components are open and also accessible, because you can't control the access to it, and you need to have all the components open in order to be open.
Yeah, I think for the community, just having access to data, and I think maybe it's the same with academia. Now that Dmitry mentioned it, just having access, but like, sure, we have access even to the data available on the internet. If you're part of the community, sure, you have access to it, but like it's weird access. It's not like you're going to run a crawler to basically get all of the same data that OpenAI got just basically from commercial suppliers of that same data. So having data sets exposed in a consumable way. So for example, just again, to give a highlight and maybe a bit of a shout out, Linux Foundation has just recently started an initiative around data and how sort of data for AI training needs to be managed, evolved, accessed. So they have a, for example, program for satellite image data that again is meant to be given to the community. So obviously it comes from people who collect it using satellites, but they expect the community to do wonderful things with it. But today, if you go and you try to do something useful even with that data set is just a bunch of Parquet files on S3 someplace, right? It's like, is it the most convenient way? I would say no, because again, if you think about emerging community, all of the data sets that I'm consuming are probably someplace, sort of mediated or made available to me through Hugging Face. So the fact and I'm talking like really small mundane issues. That barrier that the data set that Linux Foundation has put out is not really quite available on Hugging Face the same way that everything else is available to me. Like that's already a put off. Like it sort of makes it a little more difficult for me to use it. So coming up with ways and methods how we can actually make everybody be able to access data in safe and predictable way, I think it's the key.
Yeah, but again, so there are questions of data, and at least in my experience, quite often there are very interesting databases, but they are all fragmented, and it's really hard to get access to a lot of it. So if you collaborate with someone, you get, so a lot of collaboration is actually, I will give you my data and you give me yours. So it's like these quite often personal communications, but also access to infrastructure. And that's completely different things. So you need a lot of computing power that we don't have. And then there is also a question of quality of data. So if I really want to do something really serious where I can be quite certain about results, I also want to be certain that data is clean, it's, for example, that it's not poisoned. So how do I know this?
Yeah, and I think it's a great point because, again, open, when we say open, there's actually built-in trust when it comes to software. Like for right or wrong reasons, we can actually debate it. I think it's not for the right reasons all the time, but open is associated with clean, transparent, safe to use, in a sense that at least it got peer-reviewed by the community. But I absolutely agree with you. With the data, it's absolutely not the same.
And especially with AI, since we don't really quite understand what's going on inside, it's very hard to be sure that it's doing what you think it's doing. Yep.
Yeah, and I think it leads us to the second question about data, which is, okay, it's open, but are there any actual collaboration methodologies around it? Are there any place people can give their feedback, for example, as we're saying, or change this data set? So it's every time it's a new data set. Actually, it's the same with models. Every time it's just a new model. How do you know what happened there? What, if we don't have all the data training sets and everything, methodologies, how it was trained, how do you even know that these two models, what changed between these two models? How can you compare them? If somebody reviewed the previous one, does it mean that the current one gets, again, with software, we at least know what the difference is between versions. Here we don't. So what do you think about, actually I'm not even gonna ask like about how to solve this problem, but approaches to solving these problems. What are the communities, the discussions, the efforts to solve, to address this problem, to bring different parts of the market to talk about it? So what's missing? Are there all this discussion already happening or not? Are these tools existing or not? Are these methodologies being even developed by somebody? So what's your view? Is it, for example, inside enterprises or somewhere in the open? So have you seen them happening, like, or it's just wait and see? What's your view?
I think from an enterprise perspective, inside companies or for enterprises using AI, the solutions are becoming a little clearer. Things like Amazon Bedrock, which provide an environment and a selection of models and a way to bring your data in and train your models for your use case, because it's a much more controlled environment. But from an open source collaboration perspective, I think it's really, really wild, wild west, as they say. It's such early days. The workflow, the tools, the standards of how we all work together, how we groom the data, how we use the data, what's the licensing model, everything is being defined as AI is evolving so rapidly and fast. So that's the challenge. It's, the old analogy of I'm flying the plane and building the plane at the same time. And I don't know if it's the role of foundations to take a central role to kind of say, how do we make sure that there's common standards and best practices, or industry or academia, but someone needs to kind of be at the center of getting all of us together and saying, this is how we'll do it, and this is the workflow.
I actually think, honestly, I have a pretty bold, view in all of this. I think this is like a bajillion-dollar question for our industry, and whoever cracks it up, and by it I mean enabling massive open collaboration on developing something like a foundational model, so that it's not just 5 guys in OpenAI who do that, but it's basically like millions of people. Like think of Linux kernel versus OpenAI, right? It's like whoever enables that level of collaboration on AI models will, first of all, get the biggest community out there, and we know how much money you get for getting the biggest community out there, but that's not even the most important part or most interesting part for me. Because I think once that gets done, and that will get done, but to Nitya's point, I don't think who or where or like how it will get done, but I would say in the next 3 to 5 years it will get done. And what I predict then, what we will see happening is the enterprises will completely change in how they consume the AI. So my prediction is that because of that, a phenomenon similar to inner source, because remember how like open source defined the rules of the game, and at first enterprises sort of ignored it, but then everybody looked at it and said like, even for software development, these are really good rules of the game, like having unit tests and having peer reviews and having open communications, and like these are the really good playbooks to run even your internal software team. So all of a sudden we had this phenomenon of inner source, basically bringing open source practices back to the internal teams of enterprise, even if they worked on a completely closed source and proprietary product. So my prediction is that, again, 3 to 5 years, we see this huge change in how open source does this collaboration. 5 to, let's say, 7 years, enterprises completely jump on that same bandwagon. And I'm sorry to say that if you're in, let's say, ML ops, your company will probably get obsolete by then. But hey, 7 years is a nice runway, so try to sell it. But that's how I see it. It's one of the biggest disruptions coming to our industries, as the way I see it.
So from my perspective, one of important things is kind of to have solid understanding of what's going on. And I think that for this, there should be much more collaboration between various communities, because there are very different perspectives. So obviously my perspective, my thoughts about all of these are very different, because I'm not really particularly interested in any product, but I want to understand how it works and why it works. So in some sense, you might have a very practical point of view that it doesn't matter as long as it produces results. It's fine, but I think at some point it will be important to be sure that it really works in a predictable way.
And I promise I didn't put up my good friend to it, but I think he basically just hit on how I think about cracking that problem. So I think in order to enable that massive collaboration, explainability will become the key to that solution. And it's not because of some, really altruistic, reasons. It's just because if we want that to happen, we have to have explainable AI.
Yep. Because you could examine the software, then you could contribute to it. If you can't examine what it is, then it's hard to, change it, modify it, challenge it from a bias perspective or ethics perspective or fairness perspective. And frankly, we need everybody involved because we don't want just a small group of people defining how credit cards are given or loans are given or make all these important decisions in our life. We want a lot of people to be involved to make it fair.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, to that point, we are having this kind of discussions not the first time. And of course, there is a OSI initiative to define what OpenAI is. But it is at least the first, for me, time that we actually have academia on the panel. So these interdisciplinary discussions actually lack a lot of just communities at this point. So there are usually enterprises and regulators. And we're not going to talk regulation this time because it's too big of a question, and we'd rather have some questions from the audience. But at least getting the interdisciplinary dialogue, I think, is really important. And I have been warned that it's time for the questions right now. So thank you all for the panelists, and now it's for the audience to suggest some other topics.
Thank you so much. I guess one of the things you've mentioned early on is the accessibility piece, but also the standards. And maybe one of the harder things to do is to change how people are already working in large organizations. So I see a big opportunity in terms of new entrants, fresh graduates, people entering that job market, because it's going to be easier to say, here's some standards, let's build them together, let's make them the standard. And potentially academia has a role to play in assisting with some of that coordination. But then once they go out into the real world, they then end up in hundreds of different organizations and potentially could disseminate that information. So is there an opportunity there? And are there what's your opinion on that? Thanks.
I think there needs to be a stronger partnership between research universities and the AI ML community and the old open source community so that we can learn from each other. And universities, you're right, have a strong role to play in creating new models of development and collaboration. Yes. Room for that. Yes.
We'll take two questions, one here and one here, and then we'll close.
Hi, there's a lot of open washing going on, especially in the AI space, and especially, a lot of the innovations are happening from those, organizations who are kind of guilty of open washing. What is the best way to defend against open washing in AI?
So before you answer that question, for those in the room, do you mind clarifying what is open washing, and then answer that question for me, please?
Open washing is basically using the name open to effectively defend your business positioning, to effectively create a moat that didn't exist before, but because you just call it open, now you're defended against attacks from either competitors or regulators or anybody else. And yes, that is true. That's happening a lot. I actually participate in this OSI effort on defining open, and to some extent, I think what protected the open source software is the fact that OSI at some point got created pretty early on in the game. And we basically said like, okay, so these licenses are truly open source, and you can experiment with licensing. It's your software. Like, we don't mind. Just don't call it open source. Like, we maintain the brand, and if you want to do something else, just don't use the name. So the problem is that with the software, it was actually much easier to define what it is that we're protecting. With AI, so my last, for example, conversation within the OSI community was like, well, we're trying to define what open AI is, but can we at least define what is an open, like, what is the AI model? Like, just the pure definition, right? What is the artifact that is given to people, and what do we want people to do with that artifact? Because all of the open source freedoms, and effectively that's what OSI is in business of, protecting your freedoms as either a consumer or a developer, but all of these freedoms are completely meaningless unless there is an object to which those freedoms apply. You cannot really talk about an abstract freedom. Like, a freedom always applies to a certain set of outcomes or a certain set of actions that you want to take. And the problem is that the open washing applies at that level. Like, people try to redefine what is a model. Like, we had some big corporations, who want to call their models open, and they're like, well, if we just release the weights, but it's like, no, because it's this whole thing going on, right? How do we protect against it? Just community efforts. I feel that OSI is doing the right thing. I know Linux Foundation is doing it, but I would implore everybody, if you have a local jurisdiction like UK, and if you have anybody in business of protecting freedoms of open source users today, talk to them about how important it is to take AI into the consideration and be in scope.
I want to take more questions, but my handlers are telling me that we need to move on. So let's put our hands together for this amazing panel.